Bob wasn't exactly living the American dream, but he was comfortably numb in its vicinity. His house, a slightly too small bungalow in the meticulously planned community of Pleasantville Estates, was his sanctuary, his fortress of solitude against the creeping conformity that permeated the neighborhood. On this particular Saturday, Bob was deeply engaged in his favorite pastime, competitive couch-sitting, an Olympic sport he'd been training for his entire adult life. The TV flickered with the comforting glow of a monster truck rally, a symphony of roaring engines and crushed metal that soothed his soul. A half-eaten bag of cheese puffs rested precariously on his ample belly, each puff a testament to his dedication to the art of relaxation. Suddenly, the front door exploded inward with the force of a poorly aimed missile. Bob, startled, nearly choked on a cheese puff, sending orange dust flying across the room like a miniature Cheeto supernova. Two figures stood silhouetted in the doorway, radiating an aura of smug authority. Pleasantville Estates Homeowners Association. "Open up! We know you're in there!" one of them bellowed, his voice cracking slightly as he tried to project an air of command that his khaki shorts and polo shirt simply couldn't support. Bob squinted. "HOA? What in the name of Martha Stewart is going on?" The two figures, who looked suspiciously like they'd been cloned from the same batch of suburban dad DNA, strode into the living room with the confidence of men who believed they were doing God's work, or at least Karen, the HOA president's work, which in Pleasantville Estates was pretty much the same thing. "I am Chad," the khaki-clad man on the left declared, puffing out his chest. "And this is Brad. We're here to inform you that you are in violation of several HOA regulations." Brad, the khaki-clad man on the right, nodded in solemn agreement. "Grave violations," he added, as if Bob had personally insulted their mothers. Bob, still recovering from the cheese puff incident, stared at them blankly. "Violations? Like what? Did I accidentally paint my house purple in the middle of the night?" Chad consulted a clipboard that looked suspiciously like it had been stolen from a middle school PE teacher. "Firstly, your lawn is unacceptable. Regulation 3.2.b clearly states that lawns must be maintained at a height of precisely 2.5 inches. Yours appears to be approaching 3. He said this last part with the horrified tone of a doctor delivering a terminal diagnosis. Bob glanced out the window at his perfectly green, albeit slightly shaggy, lawn. 3 inches? That's practically a putting green. What's the big deal? Brad stepped forward, his face contorted in a mask of disapproval. "The big deal, sir, is that we have standards in Pleasantville Estates. We strive for uniformity, for pleasantness. Your unkempt lawn is an eyesore, a blight on our otherwise perfect community. Secondly," Chad continued, flipping through his clipboard, "your lawn ornaments, Regulation 7.4, clearly prohibits kitsch, garish, or otherwise aesthetically offensive lawn decorations. Your gnome collection," he shuddered. "It's a disgrace." Bob's eyes widened in mock horror. "My gnomes? They're vintage. They're ironic. They're hideous," Brad corrected. Bob sighed. He knew this was coming. Karen, the HOA president, had been waging a silent war against his gnome collection for months, ever since he'd placed a particularly flamboyant gnome, affectionately named Norman Bates, near the edge of his property, staring directly at her kitchen window. He suspected this was less about lawn aesthetics and more about Karen's deep-seated hatred of joy. "And finally," Chad said, his voice dripping with self-importance, "the matter of your vehicle. Regulation 12.1.c states that all vehicles must be parked in the garage overnight. Your pickup truck, which I might add, is an eyesore." "Hey, Bessie is a classic," Bob protested, his voice rising in indignation. "She's got character. Besides, my garage is full of stuff. Stuff that should be disposed of," Brad said firmly. "Or, better yet, organized according to the HOA-approved storage system, detailed in Appendix G, subsection 4, paragraph 2, which I'm sure you're familiar with." Bob stared at them, his brain struggling to process the sheer absurdity of the situation. "So, let me get this straight. You're barging into my house, on a Saturday, to harass me about my lawn, my gnomes, and my truck? Is this really what the HOA does all day? Chad and Brad exchanged a look of smug satisfaction. It is our duty, sir, to uphold the standards of Pleasantville Estates. Failure to comply with these regulations will result in a fine. Continued non-compliance could lead to further action. Further action? Bob raised an eyebrow. Like what? Are you going to send in the gnome police? Confiscate my cheese puffs? We have the authority to levy fines, restrict access to community amenities, and, in extreme cases, initiate foreclosure proceedings, Chad said, his voice dripping with menace. Bob's eyes narrowed. Foreclosure? Over a few inches of grass and some garden gnomes? That's insane. As the two HOA enforcers continued to lecture Bob on the importance of lawn maintenance and the dangers of gnome-related anarchy, a low growl rumbled from the hallway. Chad and Brad, momentarily distracted by their own self-importance, failed to notice the sound. Bob, however, recognized it instantly. It was the sound of Princess, his 90 kilograms pit bull, being awakened from her nap. And Princess, bless her loyal heart, did not appreciate uninvited guests, especially those who were disturbing her Saturday afternoon snooze. Chad cleared his throat, preparing to deliver the final blow, the one that would surely break Bob's spirit and force him to conform to the HOA's iron will. Therefore, Mr. He checked his clipboard again. Johnson, you have 24 hours to rectify these violations. Failure to do so will result in a fine of... He never got to finish the sentence. Princess emerged from the hallway like a furry, four-legged freight train, her eyes fixed on Chad and Brad with a laser-like intensity. Her growl intensified, morphing into a full-throated roar that shook the very foundations of the house. Chad and Brad, finally realizing the gravity of their situation, turned to face the canine behemoth, their faces draining of color faster than a politician caught in a scandal. Bob, sensing an opportunity for some much-needed payback, feigned terror. Oh no, Princess, down girl, they're just friends. He said this with a completely unconvincing tremor in his voice. Princess, of course, wasn't buying it. She saw two strange men in her house, threatening her beloved Bob, and she was not happy. She lowered her head, her muscles bunching beneath her sleek, powerful frame, and let out another earth-shattering bark. Chad and Brad, their khaki shorts suddenly feeling very inadequate, stumbled backward, their eyes wide with primal fear. Nice doggy, Chad stammered, his voice barely a whisper. Good doggy. Princess wasn't interested in being nice. She was interested in protecting her home and her human. With a final, deafening bark, she lunged. The scene that followed could only be described as a masterclass in canine intimidation. Chad and Brad, formerly the self-assured enforcers of Pleasantville Estates' suburban tranquility, were now reduced to quivering masses of khaki and polo shirts, desperately backpedaling away from the approaching fury of Princess. Whoa, easy girl. We're just leaving, Chad squeaked, his voice reaching a pitch usually reserved for operatic sopranos and castrated squirrels. He tripped over a throw rug, landing in an ungraceful heap near the coffee table, scattering cheese puffs across the floor like orange confetti celebrating his imminent demise. Brad, not faring much better, attempted to vault over the sofa, but his athletic prowess proved woefully inadequate. He clipped his foot, sending the floral-patterned cushions flying and executing a faceplant that would have made a professional wrestler proud. Princess, meanwhile, was in her element. She wasn't actually trying to bite them, yet, but her display of raw power was enough to send a clear message. Get out of my house, and never, ever come back. She circled them, a furry, four-legged predator toying with her prey, her growls escalating into a series of menacing barks that echoed through the house. Bob, relishing the moment, couldn't help but stifle a laugh. He played his part perfectly, feigning concern while secretly enjoying the spectacle of the HOA bullies being humiliated by his beloved pit bull. Princess, no. Bad dog. They're with the government. They're here to check the cheese puff supply. Princess, surprisingly, seemed to understand the assignment. She continued her menacing dance, occasionally nipping at their heels just to keep them on their toes. Literally. Chad, scrambling to his feet, managed to squeeze past the coffee table and make a beeline for the front door. "We're sorry. We didn't mean any harm. It was a misunderstanding," he shouted, his voice cracking with desperation. Brad, still sprawled on the floor, looked up at Princess with pleading eyes. "Please, lady. I have a wife and kids. I just wanted a nice lawn." Princess responded with a snort that sent a stray cheese puff flying across the room. Seeing their escape route clear, Chad and Brad bolted for the door, tripping over each other in their haste to escape the clutches of the furry Avenger. They burst out of the house and onto the perfectly manicured lawn, their faces a mask of pure terror. Princess, not content to let them off so easily, pursued them with relentless determination. She chased them across the lawn, around the gnome collection, giving Norman Bates a respectful nod as she passed, and onto the sidewalk, barking furiously all the way. The neighbors, drawn by the commotion, peeked out from behind their pristine curtains, their faces a mixture of shock and amusement. This was, without a doubt, the most exciting thing to happen in Pleasantville Estates since Mrs. Abernathy accidentally set her cat on fire while trying to light a scented candle. Chad and Brad, their dignity completely shattered, scrambled into their HOA-branded golf cart. Yes, they actually had an HOA-branded golf cart, and sped away, leaving a trail of dust and humiliation in their wake. Princess, satisfied that she had successfully defended her home, trotted back to the house, wagging her tail proudly. Bob, standing on the porch, greeted her with a hearty laugh and a well-deserved belly rub. "Good girl, Princess. You showed them who's boss. You're the best dog in the whole world." Princess, basking in the praise, licked Bob's face with slobbery affection. As the dust settled, Bob surveyed the scene. His living room was a disaster zone, covered in cheese puffs, scattered cushions, and the remnants of a shattered sense of suburban peace. But he couldn't have been happier. He had just witnessed the glorious spectacle of two HOA bullies being utterly humiliated by his beloved pit bull. It was a victory for freedom, for individuality, and for the right to have a slightly overgrown lawn and a questionable collection of garden gnomes. But Bob knew that this was just the beginning. The HOA, and especially Karen, wouldn't let this go so easily. They would retaliate, and when they did, Bob would be ready. He would unleash the full power of Princess and his own brand of sarcastic defiance upon the unsuspecting residents of Pleasantville Estates. He started by grabbing his phone and recording a quick video of the chaotic aftermath, complete with close-ups of the scattered cheese puffs and the slightly damaged gnomes. He added a dramatic voiceover. "This is what happens when you mess with Bob and Princess. Stay tuned for more HOA apocalypse updates." He uploaded the video to social media, hashtagging it #HOApocalypse, #PitbullJustice, and #GunOwnPower. Within minutes, the video went viral, racking up thousands of views and comments. People from all over the internet were cheering on Bob and Princess and condemning the tyranny of the HOA. Bob grinned. He had just turned a minor incident into a full-blown social media sensation. He was winning the battle for public opinion, one cheese puff and one garden gnome at a time. But he wasn't done yet. He knew that Karen, the HOA president, was the real mastermind behind this whole ordeal. She was the one who had sent Chad and Brad to his house, armed with their clipboards and their smug sense of superiority. She was the one who had been waging a silent war against his gnome collection for months. And now it was time for Bob to take the fight to her. He began plotting his revenge, brainstorming ideas for the ultimate HOA apocalypse. He would expose their corruption, their hypocrisy, and their utter lack of common sense. He would turn Pleasantville Estates into a battleground for freedom, where the residents would rise up against the tyrannical rule of the HOA, and he would have Princess by his side every step of the way, his loyal furry companion, his secret weapon, and the undisputed queen of the HOA apocalypse. He looked at Princess, who was now happily chewing on a discarded cheese puff, and smiled. "Get ready, girl," he said. "It's time to take down the HOA. The internet, as it often does, had turned Bob and Princess into overnight sensations. Hashtag HO Apocalypse was trending worldwide, and Bob was fielding interview requests from news outlets ranging from the local dog-walking blog to hard copy. He even got a DM from PETA, offering Princess an endorsement deal, which he politely declined. Princess preferred her cheese puffs. While the internet fame was amusing, Bob knew he had to strike while the iron was hot. This wasn't just about his lawn and gnomes. It was about exposing the HOA's systemic absurdity and Karen's iron-fisted reign. He was ready to weaponize the internet's outrage. First, he dove deep into the Pleasantville Estate's HOA bylaws, a document so dense and convoluted, it made the U.S. tax code look like a children's picture book. He discovered a treasure trove of ridiculous regulations and questionable financial practices. For example, a $500 fine for having excessive holiday cheer, defined as more than 3 inflatable decorations, and a mysterious landscaping enhancement fund that seemed to be funding Karen's exotic orchid collection. Armed with this ammunition, Bob started a blog, HOATLY Contested, where he meticulously documented the HOA's misdeeds, complete with scanned documents and scathing commentary. He encouraged other residents to share their own horror stories, and soon, the blog became a repository of HOA grievances, a digital support group for the victims of suburban tyranny. Next, Bob decided to escalate the psychological warfare. He knew Karen was obsessed with her pristine garden, a meticulously curated landscape of perfectly symmetrical flower beds and perfectly pruned hedges. So, he began taking Princess on strategic walks through the neighborhood, making sure they passed by Karen's house at least twice a day. During these walks, Princess was encouraged to express herself. She would enthusiastically mark Karen's prize-winning rose bushes with strategically placed sprinklings of canine perfume, leaving behind a distinctly pungent aroma that clashed horribly with the scent of organic fertilizer. Bob even trained Princess to accidentally dig up Karen's prize-winning petunias, replacing them with strategically placed plastic flamingos. The effect on Karen was immediate and satisfying. Bob witnessed her storming out of her house on several occasions, shrieking at Princess and waving her gardening gloves in the air like a crazed conductor. The sight of Karen losing her composure was more satisfying than any award-winning meme. But Bob knew he needed to do more than just harass Karen's garden. He needed to mobilize the residents of Pleasantville Estates to transform their simmering resentment into open rebellion. He decided to organize a protest, a good old-fashioned demonstration against the HOA's tyranny. He plastered the neighborhood with flyers, adorned with a picture of Princess looking particularly fierce, and the slogan, "Unleash the Fury, Protest the HO." He even created a catchy protest song, set to the tune of "We Will Rock You," with lyrics like, "HOA, HOA, you will pay, gonna make you go away." The day of the protest arrived, and Bob was pleasantly surprised by the turnout. Dozens of residents, armed with signs and a shared sense of outrage, gathered in front of Karen's house. Some held signs that read, "Gnomes Lives Matter," while others simply said, "Down with the HOA." Bob, standing on a makeshift stage, a lawn chair strategically placed on a wheelbarrow, addressed the crowd. "We are here today to say enough is enough. We will no longer tolerate the HOA's ridiculous rules, their exorbitant fees, and their blatant disregard for our freedom." The crowd roared its approval. Then he introduced the guest of honor, Princess. He hoisted her onto the wheelbarrow, where she sat majestically, surveying her adoring fans. The crowd erupted in applause, chanting "Princess, Princess, Princess." The climax of the protest came when Bob led the crowd in a rousing rendition of his protest song. Even Karen, who had been watching from her window with a mixture of anger and disbelief, couldn't help but tap her foot to the beat. The protest was a resounding success. The local news covered the event, and soon, the HOA's misdeeds were plastered all over the evening news. The pressure on Karen and the HOA board began to mount. Bob knew he was winning, but he also knew that Karen wouldn't give up without a fight. She was a formidable opponent, a master manipulator with a talent for passive-aggressive warfare. As the protest wound down, Bob noticed Karen emerging from her house, a steely glint in her eye. She marched towards him, her face a mask of barely suppressed rage. "Johnson," she said, her voice dripping with venom. "You think you've won? You think you've exposed me? You're wrong. This is just the beginning. I'm gonna make your life a living hell. You and that dog." Bob smiled. "Bring it on, Karen. I'm ready for you. And so is Princess." He gave Princess a reassuring pat on the head. Karen glared at them both, then turned and stalked back to her house, slamming the door behind her. Bob knew that the final battle was coming. He could feel it in his bones, and he was ready to unleash the full fury of the HOA apocalypse. He looked at Princess, who was now happily licking the cheese puff residue off his fingers, and smiled. "Get ready, girl," he said. "It's time to finish this." The sweet taste of revenge was almost within reach. But Karen had a few tricks up her sleeve, and Bob was about to find out just how far she was willing to go to maintain her power. Karen, predictably, did not take the public humiliation lying down. She retaliated with the fury of 1,000 suns, or, at least, the fury of 1,000 meticulously manicured suburban moms. The HOA, under her direction, launched a full-scale offensive against Bob, weaponizing every obscure bylaw they could find. He received violation notices for everything imaginable: unauthorized use of a garden hose between the hours of 3 p.m. and 3:15 p.m., excessive whistling during the community quiet hour, defined as any time before noon, and the particularly egregious unapproved pattern of lawn mowing resulting in a non-uniform appearance. Karen even filed a formal complaint with Animal Control, claiming that Princess was a vicious and dangerous animal who posed a threat to the community. The Animal Control officer, a weary-looking man who clearly had better things to do than mediate suburban squabbles, arrived at Bob's house with a clipboard and a sigh. "Ma'am," Bob said with his most charmingly sarcastic smile, "this dog wouldn't hurt a fly, unless that fly was wearing khaki shorts and a polo shirt and trying to tell me what to do with my lawn." The Animal Control officer, clearly familiar with the #HO Apocalypse saga, chuckled. He spent a few minutes petting Princess, who naturally charmed him instantly, and declared her to be a perfectly well-behaved and adorable canine citizen. Karen's attempts to harass Bob only strengthened his resolve and fueled the internet's outrage. The #HO Apocalypse movement gained even more momentum, attracting attention from national news outlets and even sparking a congressional inquiry into HOA abuses. Bob, riding the wave of public support, decided to go for the jugular. He organized a formal recall election, aiming to oust Karen and the rest of the HOA board. He rallied his supporters, armed with petitions, protest signs, and a deep-seated hatred of petty regulations. The day of the election arrived, and the community center was packed with angry residents eager to cast their votes. The atmosphere was electric, charged with the palpable energy of a suburban revolution. Karen, looking pale and defeated, arrived at the community center with her usual entourage of sycophantic supporters. She tried to put on a brave face, but Bob could see the fear in her eyes. She knew her reign was coming to an end. The voting process was long and contentious, with heated debates erupting over everything from lawn height to gnome placement. But in the end, the results were clear. Bob and his slate of reform candidates had won by a landslide. The crowd erupted in cheers, chanting HOA Apocalypse, HOA Apocalypse. Bob, standing on a table, raised his arms in victory. "We did it," he shouted. "We took back our community. We defeated the tyranny of the HOA. Pleasantville Estates is free." Karen, humiliated and defeated, stormed out of the community center, her supporters trailing behind her like dejected ducklings. She disappeared into the night, presumably to plot her revenge, but Bob wasn't worried. He had Princess. With Karen gone, Bob and his fellow reformers set about dismantling the HOA's oppressive regime. They repealed the most ridiculous bylaws, reduced the fees, and replaced the old, stuffy board members with people who actually cared about the community. Pleasantville Estates was transformed. Lawns grew a little longer, gnomes flourished, and the sound of laughter filled the air. The community became a more vibrant, tolerant, and, well, pleasant place to live. Bob, now the president of the HOA, a position he accepted with great reluctance and a healthy dose of sarcasm, made sure that the new HOA served the community, not the other way around. He organized community events, encouraged diversity, and even created a Gnome Appreciation Day, which quickly became a local holiday. And what about Princess? She became a local hero, a symbol of resistance against suburban tyranny. She was featured on the cover of Dog Fancy magazine, received a key to the city, and even had a park named after her. She lived out her days in blissful comfort, surrounded by adoring fans and an endless supply of cheese puffs. Sometimes, late at night, Bob would sit on his porch with Princess by his side, watching the fireflies dance in the twilight. He would think about Karen and the HOA, and he would smile. He had won. He had defeated the forces of suburban conformity and created a better world, one cheese puff and one garden gnome at a time. The HOA apocalypse was over. Pleasantville Estates was finally at peace. Well, folks, that's the story of the HOA apocalypse. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please give this video a big thumbs up. Don't forget to share it with your friends who have suffered under the tyranny of their own HOAs. And most importantly, hit that subscribe button. I'll be posting more stories about life, liberty, and the pursuit of cheese puffs. Plus, I might even share some tips on how to train your dog to take down HOA bullies.